Tunde stood at the gate of his home, looking at the black SUV parked by the curb. His parents were already inside, talking to the driver, ready for him to begin his journey to the prestigious boarding school they had chosen for him. The school, known for its academic excellence and its alumni who went on to become influential leaders, was the dream of every ambitious Nigerian parent. Tunde's mother, a school teacher, and his father, a successful businessman, believed this was the best path for his future. As Tunde's parents kissed him goodbye and reassured him, he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He was nervous, excited, and a little scared. He had never been away from home for so long, and the thought of being thrust into a new environment where he had to make friends and fit in was overwhelming. But his parents were hopeful. They believed that attending such a prestigious institution would open doors to unimaginable opportunities. "Stay focused, Tunde," his father reminded him. "Education is the key to your success. Don't forget your roots." The journey felt long, but eventually, Tunde arrived at the sprawling campus, with towering buildings, well-maintained lawns, and students moving about in crisp uniforms. He was assigned a dormitory room and introduced to his roommates, some of whom had been at the school for years. They were all older and seemed confident, as though they had mastered the school's unspoken rules. Tunde felt small and out of place, unsure of how he would navigate the complex social dynamics of this new world. A few weeks into his stay at the boarding school, Tunde's feelings of isolation began to subside when he befriended a group of older boys. They were known as the elite students, popular for their confidence and the way they commanded respect from the younger students. They seemed to have everything: wealth, power, and an aura of authority. At first, Tunde admired them from a distance, watching them in awe as they carried themselves with ease and grace, never appearing to care about the rules. One evening, the boys invited Tunde to their room for a special meeting. He hesitated but eventually agreed, curious about what they had to offer. As he entered the room, he was greeted with smoke from cigarettes and the sound of loud laughter. One of the boys, Uche, handed him a cigarette, urging him to join in. Tunde's heart raced, but with a sense of wanting to fit in, he took a drag. The rush of nicotine was overwhelming, but it also gave him a strange sense of belonging. That night, they talked about gambling, money, and how to outsmart the younger students for their own amusement. From that moment, Tunde was hooked. He found himself spending more time with this group, drawn into their world of rebellion. They taught him how to gamble, how to manipulate the younger students into doing their bidding, and how to use his newfound knowledge of the school system to his advantage. As he got deeper into this dangerous game, Tunde began to lose sight of the reasons his parents had sent him to the school in the first place. Tunde's transformation into someone he no longer recognized was swift. The more he hung out with the older boys, the more detached he became from his original values. He was now involved in activities that would have horrified his parents. But the money, the power, and the control over others were intoxicating. One afternoon, he crossed a line he hadn't expected to. Amoka, a girl he had once been friends with during the early days at school, came to him, looking distraught. She had been caught sneaking out of the dormitory at night, something strictly prohibited. The teachers had been informed, and it was only a matter of time before she would be disciplined. Amoka begged Tunde for help, asking him to keep her secret and promising that she would owe him a favor in return. Tunde, in a moment of both temptation and power, agreed to help her, but on one condition. He would keep her secret, but only if she paid him back by doing whatever he wanted. The idea of holding someone else's secrets over their head felt thrilling, and Tunde soon found himself blackmailing Amoka. He demanded money, her homework, and even her social connections. He didn't care about the consequences anymore, he was in too deep. Unbeknownst to Tunde, this decision would haunt him. His actions were not just petty, they were destructive, and soon, he would have to face the fallout. As the weeks went by, Tunde's relationship with Amoka became strained. Every time they crossed paths, there was a sense of unease in the air. Amoka, once his friend, now seemed like a mere pawn in a game that Tunde didn't fully understand. Her once cheerful demeanor was replaced with a look of constant fear, and her eyes seemed to avoid his whenever they spoke. Tunde, for the first time, began to feel the weight of his actions. The blackmail had started innocently enough, or so he had thought. He convinced himself that Amoka had gotten herself into trouble, and this was just a way of ensuring that she wouldn't make the same mistakes again. But as time passed, the guilt began to gnaw at him. He started to see the pain it was causing her. Still, he couldn't stop. It was too late to back out now. The power, the control, and the satisfaction of having leverage over someone were too seductive. He had already crossed that line, and there was no going back. At the same time, Tunde's actions were starting to affect the group of older boys he hung out with. They were noticing changes in his behavior. He was no longer the shy, naive boy they had first taken under their wing. Instead, he was becoming more calculating, more ruthless. They encouraged him, telling him that he was growing into the man he was meant to be. Tunde, however, began to wonder if the person he was becoming was someone he truly wanted to be. One day, as Tunde was walking to class, he saw his parents standing outside the school gates, looking serious. His heart skipped a beat. It had been months since they last visited, and he had been so caught up in his new life that he hadn't thought much about them. He walked over cautiously, a mix of excitement and dread swirling within him. His parents greeted him warmly, but there was a noticeable tension in their voices. "Let's take a walk, son," his father said, putting a hand on his shoulder. Tunde's heart pounded in his chest as they walked toward a quiet spot away from the other students. It was then that his parents revealed what had been happening. They had received an anonymous letter detailing Tunde's actions, the gambling, the manipulation, the blackmail. His mother's eyes were filled with hurt, and his father's face was stone cold. "Is this true, Tunde?" his father asked, his voice firm but tinged with disappointment. Tunde was caught off guard. His first instinct was to deny everything, but the shame was too overwhelming. He had been caught, and there was no escape. As he looked at his parents, he saw the hurt in their eyes, the same eyes that had once trusted him completely. It was in that moment that Tunde realized just how far he had fallen. Tunde stood there, speechless, his mind racing as his parents awaited an answer. The weight of their disappointment pressed down on him, more suffocating than any punishment. For a moment, he thought about lying, denying everything and blaming others, but he saw the hurt in his mother's eyes and the frustration in his father's. They weren't asking him because they didn't believe in him, they were asking because they wanted to understand how their son, whom they had sent to this school with such high hopes, could have fallen so far. His father's voice broke through his thoughts. "Why, Tunde? Why did you think this was the way to go? You had so much potential, so much promise." Tunde's stomach churned with guilt, and he could feel his throat tightening. He didn't know how to explain what had happened. How could he? The truth was, Tunde had gotten lost in the desire for power and approval. The group of older boys had shown him a world he hadn't known existed, one where he could control people, where he could have everything he wanted without consequence. But as he stood there, facing his parents, he realized that the price of this world had been his own integrity. He had sacrificed everything for fleeting moments of satisfaction. I didn't think it would go this far," Tunde muttered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. His father's face hardened as he shook his head. "You need to start making better choices, Tunde. This isn't you." His mother wrapped her arms around him, and for the first time in a long while, Tunde felt the comfort of her embrace. But it wasn't enough to erase the shame. After the confrontation with his parents, Tunde was sent back to the school, but everything felt different. The once thrilling world of gambling and manipulation now seemed hollow. The older boys, who had once seemed like mentors, were now distant figures, their charm no longer captivating. Ton found himself withdrawing from them, realizing that they had only used him as a tool to satisfy their own desires. The school administrators were aware of the situation now, and Ton could sense their watchful eyes on him. He knew that they were waiting for him to slip again, to show them that he wasn't truly capable of reform. But deep down, Ton knew he couldn't go back to his old ways. His parents' disappointment had shaken him to his core. He had failed them, and now, he was determined to prove that he could do better. One afternoon, after classes had ended, Ton went to the headmaster's office to confess. He needed to take responsibility for what he had done, not just to his parents, but to the school and to Amoka. When the headmaster saw him, he was surprised but didn't hesitate to listen. "Sir, I've made terrible mistakes," Ton began, his voice shaky but resolute. "I was part of a group that hurt others, and I did things I'm not proud of. I want to change, but I know I can't do it alone." The headmaster nodded slowly. "You've taken the first step, Tunde. The road ahead won't be easy, but it's the right one." Ton knew that he needed to make amends, but the first person he had to apologize to was Amoka. He had tormented her, blackmailed her, and manipulated her for so long that the thought of facing her terrified him. He had been her friend once, but now, he was the very person who had betrayed her. He found her in the library, sitting alone and studying. When she looked up and saw him standing there, she immediately tensed, her eyes narrowing. "What do you want, Tunde?" she asked, her voice cold. I came to apologize," he said quietly, his heart pounding. "I've done things I can't undo, but I want you to know that I'm truly sorry for everything I did to you. I shouldn't have blackmailed you or made you feel like you owed me. I was wrong, and I want to make it right." Amoka stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she stood up and walked away, leaving Ton standing there, feeling smaller than ever. He had expected forgiveness to come easily, but he understood now that it wasn't going to be that simple. Still, he was determined to make things right. It was going to take time, but he wasn't going to give up. Ton had made a decision: he would no longer associate with the older boys who had led him astray. It wasn't an easy decision to make, especially since they had once been the only people who truly seemed to understand him. But their influence was toxic, and every time he spent time with them, he felt himself slipping further away from the person he wanted to be. He started to distance himself from them, no longer participating in their schemes and conversations. At first, they were confused, then angry. They tried to lure him back, promising him more power, more money, and more respect. But Ton wasn't interested anymore. He had seen enough to know that the life they were living was one of deception and emptiness. One day, as Ton was walking through the school courtyard, he overheard one of the older boys, Uche, talking about how Ton had betrayed them. "He thinks he's better than us now," Uche said, his voice dripping with contempt. "But let me tell you something, we'll make sure he doesn't get away with it." Ton didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, refusing to let their words affect him. He had chosen his path, and it was one that led away from them. Weeks passed, and Ton's efforts to reform were slow but steady. He apologized to a few of the younger students he had manipulated, and though some of them still held a grudge, many appreciated his sincerity. Amoka, however, remained distant, and Ton understood why. Trust, once broken, was not easily repaired. One evening, while sitting alone in his dormitory, Ton received a letter from home. It was from his mother. As he opened it, he found words of encouragement and love. She told him how proud she was of the steps he had taken to change, but also reminded him that he needed to continue on the right path. She wrote that they were still there for him, no matter what. Reading her words brought tears to his eyes. He had let her down, but she still believed in him. It was in that moment that Tunde made a vow to himself: he would not waste the second chance he had been given. He would work hard to regain the trust of his parents, his friends, and himself. With newfound determination, Tunde set about rebuilding his life at the school. He studied harder than he ever had, determined to prove that he was capable of more than the mistakes he had made. He also began volunteering at the school's community outreach programs, helping younger students with their homework and offering guidance when they needed it. He even reached out to Amoka again, hoping that she would eventually see that he was sincere in his desire to make amends. But she still kept her distance, and Tunde didn't push her. He understood that trust couldn't be rushed. Slowly, things started to change. The other students, seeing his efforts, began to treat him with more respect. He no longer had to rely on the older boys for validation or approval. Tunde had found his own voice, and it was one that was grounded in integrity. Just when Tunde thought he was on the path to redemption, he was faced with a test that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. One of the older boys, Chike, came to him with an offer, a chance to make a lot of money through an underground gambling scheme. Tunde was tempted. He knew how easy it would be to slip back into his old habits and feel the rush of power that came with controlling others. For a moment, he hesitated. But then, he remembered his mother's words, his father's disappointment, and the countless apologies he had made to those he had hurt. He thought of the life he wanted to build, one where he was respected not for his manipulation, but for his character. He turned Chike down flat. "Not anymore," Tunde said, his voice firm. "I've chosen a different path." Chike scoffed and walked away, but Tunde felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in a long time. He had passed the test. As time passed, Tunde's reputation began to change. He was no longer the boy who had fallen into temptation and betrayed his friends, but the one who was genuinely trying to rebuild his life. He worked tirelessly to improve academically, and his efforts didn't go unnoticed. Teachers, once skeptical of his ability to turn things around, began to praise his dedication. Other students started to approach him for help with schoolwork, and some even began to see him as a role model. Tunde was surprised but grateful for their trust. He knew it wasn't just his academic progress that had won them over, it was his character. He had shown them that even the biggest mistakes could be overcome, and he was living proof of that. Though he was no longer part of the popular group, Tunde didn't feel lonely. He had forged new friendships with people who valued him for who he was, not for his connections or ability to manipulate situations. In many ways, he felt freer than ever before. One day, several months after Tunde had started making changes, he was walking through the school courtyard when he saw Amoka sitting on a bench. Her gaze was fixed on the ground, and she looked as though she was deep in thought. Tunde hesitated for a moment, unsure if he should approach her. But this time, something inside him told him he had to. Taking a deep breath, Tunde walked over to her. "Amoka," he said gently. She looked up, and for the first time in a long time, their eyes met. "You don't have to say anything," Tunde began, "but I want you to know that I'm sorry for everything. I know I hurt you, and I can't undo the damage I've done. But I've changed, and I'm trying to be a better person. I hope one day you'll see that." Amoka studied him for a long moment, and then, for the first time in months, she spoke. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Tunde. What you did, it was wrong. But I can see that you're trying to make up for it. Maybe that counts for something." Tunde nodded, relieved that she hadn't rejected him outright. "I'll be here, whenever you're ready." Amoka didn't smile, but she didn't walk away either. It was a small victory, but it was a step in the right direction. Despite the progress Tunde had made, there were still days when the temptation to return to his old ways lingered. He had to fight against the pull of the group of older boys, who still tried to get him involved in their schemes. They would occasionally offer him money or suggest that he join them for a night of gambling or smoking. Each time, Tunde had to remind himself of how far he had come. It was a constant battle between who he used to be and who he wanted to be. Some nights, the temptation felt overwhelming. But he would think of his parents, his future, and the genuine friendships he had begun to build. That was enough to keep him on the right track. One night, when he was feeling particularly low, he found solace in a quiet corner of the school library. There, he picked up a book his father had once given him, a book on personal growth and the power of change. As he read through its pages, he found strength in the words. He wasn't perfect, and his past mistakes couldn't be erased, but they didn't define him. He had the power to shape his future, and he would. Tunde's path of redemption took an unexpected turn when he befriended Mr. Okoro, one of the school's teachers. Mr. Okoro had always been somewhat aloof, focusing more on his lessons than on interacting with students. But when Tunde stayed after class one day to ask a question, Mr. Okoro struck up a conversation with him that would change everything. "You're trying to rebuild, aren't you, Tunde?" Mr. Okoro asked, his voice soft but knowing. Tunde hesitated but nodded. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, "and I'm trying to fix them." Mr. Okoro smiled, though it was a sad smile. "We all make mistakes, Tunde. The important thing is whether you learn from them. I see you trying, and that's what matters. I've been where you are. I know how hard it can be." From that day on, Mr. Okoro became a mentor to Tunde. He offered advice, shared his own experiences, and pushed Tunde to keep going when he felt like giving up. The teacher's faith in him became a cornerstone of his own belief in himself. Despite his progress, Tunde still struggled with the isolation that came with his past. He had lost his place in the social hierarchy of the school, and though he had made new friends, there were still whispers behind his back. Some students still remembered the boy who had manipulated them and used his influence for personal gain. One afternoon, as Tunde was walking to the cafeteria, he overheard a group of students talking about him. "Do you really think he's changed?" one of them whispered. "He used to be so full of himself. I don't know if I can trust him." The words stung, and for a moment, Tunde felt that old wave of anger rise within him. But then he took a deep breath and reminded himself that he couldn't control what others thought of him. All he could control was his own actions. He had to keep moving forward, no matter what others said or thought. That night, Tunde lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, battling the voice inside him that wanted to lash out and defend himself. But he didn't. He simply closed his eyes and reminded himself that the only approval he truly needed was his own. Tunde's hard work and dedication eventually earned him a position of leadership within the school. He was appointed as a prefect, a role that came with responsibilities but also the chance to make a real difference. At first, Tunde was nervous. He didn't feel like he deserved such a position after everything that had happened. But Mr. Okoro and his other mentors assured him that this was an opportunity for him to prove not just to others, but to himself, that he had changed. As a prefect, Tunde worked hard to foster a positive environment within the school. He organized study groups, mediated disputes between students, and even helped to create a peer mentorship program. Though it was challenging, Tunde found that the more he gave to others, the more he received in return. His efforts were slowly earning him the respect of those who had once doubted him. For the first time in a long while, Tunde felt proud of himself, not for the power or control he had once sought, but for the person he was becoming. He had finally found his place, not by manipulating others, but by helping them. Tunde's transformation didn't go unnoticed. Word began to spread through the school about how he had changed, and many students began to approach him for advice. Some of them were struggling with the same temptations Tunde had once fallen victim to, while others simply needed guidance on navigating the pressures of school life. Ton found himself in a position of influence, but this time, it was different. He wasn't using his power to control or manipulate, instead, he was using it to help others. He became a sounding board for students who felt lost or confused, and he made it his mission to prevent others from making the same mistakes he had. The ripple effect of his actions reached beyond the school's walls. When Ton's parents visited him again, they were amazed at the changes they saw in him. "You've become a leader, Ton," his father said, pride shining in his eyes. "We are proud of the man you've become." Ton smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. He had finally earned his parents' pride, but more importantly, he had earned his own self-respect. As the school year drew to a close, Ton faced a crucial moment. He had been invited to speak at the school's graduation ceremony. This was a huge honor, and it would be his chance to address the entire school. He had always been shy, never one to seek the spotlight, but this time felt different. This time, he had a message he needed to share. When the day came, Ton stood before the crowd of students, teachers, and parents, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he looked out over the faces before him, he felt calm. He had a story to tell, a story of mistakes, of redemption, and of the power of change. "I know what it's like to lose your way," Ton began, his voice steady. "But I also know that it's never too late to start over. We all have the power to change, to be better than we were yesterday. It's not easy, but it's worth it." His words resonated with the students, and Ton felt a sense of fulfillment that he had never known before. He wasn't the boy who had once blackmailed his friend or gambled with his future. He was someone new, a person who had faced his mistakes, learned from them, and chosen to do better. As Ton graduated from the boarding school, he reflected on everything he had been through. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but he knew that he was ready. He had learned to trust himself, to rely on his inner strength, and to build relationships based on honesty and integrity. His parents were there, cheering him on, proud of the young man he had become. They had stood by him through his darkest moments, and now, they were witnessing his triumph. Ton knew that the future was uncertain, but he was no longer afraid. He had the tools to navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. And no matter what happened, he would never forget the lessons he had learned. The story of his journey, from misguided ambition to true redemption, had only just begun. Ton's graduation was more than just a ceremony, it was the symbolic closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. As he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, he couldn't help but feel a rush of emotions. Pride, relief, and hope mingled within him. The boy who had once felt lost, entangled in a world of deceit and self-doubt, was now a young man with a future he was determined to build. His parents, beaming with pride, waited for him at the end of the stage. The moment he stepped off, his mother embraced him tightly. "You've made us proud, Ton," she whispered. His father nodded, his face glowing with unspoken approval. The road hadn't been easy, but their faith in him had never wavered. Now, with school behind him, Ton knew the real test was just beginning. The world beyond the gates of the boarding school was vast and full of possibilities. And yet, as he looked into the faces of his fellow graduates, some of whom had gone through their own struggles, he realized he wasn't alone in this journey. The mistakes they had all made didn't define them, they had the power to shape their futures. The transition from boarding school to the real world wasn't as seamless as Ton had hoped. Though he was filled with optimism, reality quickly set in. The expectations of adulthood loomed large, and the challenges he faced in finding his place in the world outside of school were daunting. Ton's parents pushed him to pursue higher education, believing that it would ensure a stable future. But Ton had his own ideas. He wanted to take some time to explore his options, to find his true passion before committing to a path that might not align with his aspirations. This decision wasn't easy to communicate to his parents, but when he did, they reluctantly agreed, offering their support while still emphasizing the importance of education. Tunde spent the next few months working at a local community center, mentoring younger students and helping with outreach programs. His time there reaffirmed his desire to make a difference in the lives of others. As he guided the younger generation, he saw reflections of his past self, lost, confused, and searching for purpose. It became clear to him that his true calling was in helping those who felt overlooked and forgotten. But the reality was that this would be a long, difficult road, one that would require him to work hard and challenge his own limits. A few months into his time at the community center, Tunde received an unexpected call. It was from Mr. Okoro, his mentor from the school. Mr. Okoro had recently left the boarding school and taken on a new role as a director of a youth leadership initiative. The initiative focused on empowering young people in underprivileged communities, helping them rise above the challenges they faced. "We could use someone like you, Tunde," Mr. Okoro said, his voice warm but serious. "You've gone through the fire, and now you have the experience and the heart to guide others. We need people who have walked the path of redemption, people who can show others that change is possible." The offer was tempting. It was the chance to continue his journey of helping others, to be part of something larger than himself. But Tunde hesitated. He wasn't sure he was ready to leave the comfort of the community center where he had already built connections. But deep down, he knew that this was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. It was time to push himself further. After much thought, Tunde decided to accept the offer and return to a leadership role where he could make a lasting impact. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was more confident in his ability to face whatever came next. The transition to his new role was both exciting and intimidating. Tunde was now surrounded by a group of passionate, driven individuals who shared his vision for empowering the youth in their communities. They were all from different walks of life, but their shared mission brought them together. Tunde worked alongside mentors, counselors, and community leaders to create programs that taught young people about the importance of education, integrity, and resilience. His experience at the boarding school, particularly his struggles and eventual growth, gave him a unique perspective that resonated with the youth he mentored. Though it wasn't always easy, Tunde found fulfillment in the work. He had come full circle, from being the student who needed guidance to becoming the mentor who offered it. The challenges were great, but Tunde felt a deep sense of purpose in helping others avoid the mistakes he had once made. As Tunde grew more entrenched in his work, he began to encounter familiar faces from his past. Some of the older boys from school, now young men themselves, reached out to him. They had heard about his new role and were intrigued by his transformation. Some seemed genuinely curious, while others sought to drag him back into the world of gambling, smoking, and manipulation that he had left behind. One evening, Tunde found himself at a gathering, a reunion of sorts, where old friends and acquaintances had gathered. The atmosphere was full of familiar faces, many of whom had been part of the group he used to hang out with. As they chatted and laughed, Tunde felt a sense of nostalgia. The allure of his old life was strong, and for a moment, he wondered if it was easier to return to the comfort of that world. But then, he thought about everything he had worked for, the community center, his mentorship programs, the youth he was guiding. These were the things that truly mattered. He had a purpose now, one that didn't involve the empty pleasures of his past. "I'm not that person anymore," he said quietly to himself, refusing to give in to the temptation. Tunde left the gathering that night, feeling stronger than ever before. It wasn't just about avoiding the past, it was about embracing the future he was building. Months passed, and Tunde's work with the Youth Leadership Initiative began to show real results. More and more young people, especially those who had faced the greatest challenges in life, started to thrive under his mentorship. They were excelling in school, gaining confidence, and finding their own paths to success. Ton's efforts were recognized not only within the community but also by local organizations. His story of redemption and his commitment to making a difference inspired many. He was invited to speak at conferences, and his work was featured in local newspapers as an example of how perseverance and second chances could change lives. Though Ton remained humble, he couldn't deny the pride he felt in the progress he had made, not just for himself, but for those he had helped along the way. He was becoming the man his parents had always hoped he would be, the one who would rise above his mistakes and use his experiences to lift others. As Ton's reputation grew, so did the pressures. With success came new responsibilities, and he found himself balancing more than ever before. The demands of his work took up much of his time, leaving him little space for personal reflection or relaxation. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Ton sat alone in his apartment, his mind racing with thoughts. He had come so far, but was it enough? Was he really making the impact he had set out to make? And most importantly, did he truly have the strength to keep going? It was during these moments of doubt that he would return to his roots, remembering the lessons he had learned at the boarding school. He remembered the kindness of Mr. Okoro, the support of his parents, and the countless hours spent helping others. These were the things that fueled him, not the accolades or the recognition. With a deep breath, Ton closed his eyes and reminded himself that the journey was far from over. There would be more struggles, but he was ready. The impact over time, Ton's work began to show tangible results. Many of the young people he had mentored went on to pursue higher education, start their own businesses, and even return to their communities as leaders. They had learned from Ton's example, seeing that redemption was possible and that their past didn't define them. Ton was invited to speak at a graduation ceremony for one of the youth programs, and as he looked out over the smiling faces of the graduates, he couldn't help but feel overwhelmed with pride. He had done it. His work had made a difference in their lives, and now, they were ready to make a difference in the world. For the first time in years, Ton felt a deep sense of peace. He had overcome the darkness of his past and had built something lasting. He knew that no matter where life took him next, he had found his true calling. With each passing year, Ton's influence continued to grow, and so did the scale of his work. The youth initiative had expanded, and Ton's role had evolved into something far more challenging than he had ever imagined. He had become the lead coordinator for several programs, each with a wide reach and heavy responsibilities. His days were spent juggling meetings, mentorship sessions, and overseeing the operations of the programs. Despite the outward signs of success, Ton often found himself feeling overwhelmed. His passion for the cause was unwavering, but the weight of expectations, both from his colleagues and the young people he mentored, was beginning to take its toll. One evening, as he sat at his desk, buried in paperwork and emails, Ton received a call from his mother. She sounded concerned, asking if he was taking care of himself. It was a gentle reminder of something he had neglected, his personal well-being. "I'm fine, Mom," Ton said, trying to reassure her. But deep down, he knew he needed to find balance in his life again. He had sacrificed his own peace for the sake of others, and now, he needed to remember the importance of self-care. That night, Ton took a moment to reflect on everything he had achieved and how far he had come. He realized it was time to take a step back, reassess, and find a healthier way to continue his work without burning out. Ton took the following weekend off, an unusual decision for someone who had always pushed himself to the limit. He spent time alone, reflecting on his journey. He visited a quiet park near his apartment, sitting on a bench beneath the shade of an old tree. As he looked around at the families and people walking by, he allowed himself to fully acknowledge the growth he had experienced. It had been a long road from the boy who had manipulated and blackmailed his peers to the man who was now shaping the future of others. Ton smiled softly to himself, feeling a sense of gratitude for the people who had supported him along the way, his parents, Mr. Okoro, and the friends he had made in the process. They had all helped him get here. Yet, as he watched a young boy playing soccer nearby, Tunde realized there was still so much he wanted to do. The work he was doing was meaningful, but it was only a fraction of the impact he could have. He was more than just a mentor, he was a catalyst for change. Tunde felt a surge of energy and inspiration, knowing that he wasn't finished yet. There was still a world out there waiting for him to make a difference. Weeks after his time of reflection, Tunde's sense of purpose was reignited. He began to see opportunities for expanding his work, not just locally but nationally. Several organizations reached out to him, offering him leadership positions to help implement youth programs in underserved communities across Nigeria. The prospect of leading such large-scale initiatives was daunting. Tunde knew it would require him to leave behind the familiar ground of his current work and take on even greater responsibilities. But he also understood that this was his chance to leave a lasting legacy. He spent sleepless nights considering the offer, torn between the comfortable life he had built and the unknown future ahead. But in the end, he knew he had a duty to those who had once been like him, lost and searching for a way out. Tunde accepted the offer and set his sights on a new challenge, transforming youth programs on a national scale. This was the next chapter in his journey, a step toward creating a ripple effect that could reach beyond the borders of his own community. The transition to national leadership came with new challenges. Tunde found himself managing a much larger team, coordinating with government officials, corporate sponsors, and community leaders. The logistical and financial hurdles were significant, but Tunde felt a deep sense of responsibility to make sure the programs reached as many young people as possible. As the pressure mounted, Tunde often found himself working late into the night, sacrificing his personal time and pushing himself harder than ever before. He knew that the success of the programs depended on his leadership, and the stakes were higher than ever. But soon, Tunde began to feel the familiar signs of burnout creeping in. His health began to suffer, and he found it harder to stay connected with his team. Tunde's selflessness, which had once been a strength, had become his greatest weakness. He was giving so much of himself that he had nothing left to give. One evening, as he sat in his office reviewing reports, his body finally gave out. Exhausted and overwhelmed, Tunde collapsed into his chair. He realized that if he didn't take a break soon, he might not be able to continue at all. This was a wake-up call for Tunde. He had been so focused on saving others that he had forgotten to save himself. He knew it was time to delegate more, to trust his team, and to take the necessary steps to restore his health and well-being. Taking his health seriously, Tunde took a step back from his leadership role. He called a meeting with his team, informing them that he needed to focus on his recovery and that some of his responsibilities would need to be redistributed. At first, his team was hesitant, but they quickly rallied behind him, understanding the importance of Tunde's well-being. He trusted them to carry the torch in his absence, and soon, he found himself on the road to recovery. Tunde spent time reconnecting with his family, taking walks, reading, and practicing meditation. He learned that true leadership wasn't just about pushing forward, it was about knowing when to pause, reflect, and take care of oneself. As the months passed, Tunde began to regain his strength and clarity. His team flourished without his constant oversight, and the programs he had helped build continued to grow. Tunde realized that by stepping back, he had given others the opportunity to rise and lead in their own right. With his health restored, Tunde returned to his work with a new perspective. He no longer felt the need to do everything himself. Instead, he became a true mentor to the young leaders around him, guiding them, not by doing the work for them, but by empowering them to make their own decisions. He spent more time working one-on-one with the youth in the programs, listening to their struggles and offering advice. He found joy in seeing them thrive and succeed on their own. His role had evolved from a direct leader to a supportive mentor, helping others find their own paths to success. Through this shift, Tunde saw firsthand how powerful mentorship could be. The most successful leaders weren't always the ones who did the most work, they were the ones who helped others rise. As Tunde's influence grew, so did his sense of purpose. He began working with other organizations to create a network of support for at-risk youth. His vision of a national program that could change the trajectory of young lives was beginning to take shape. In partnership with the government, private sectors, and community leaders, Tunde worked to secure funding for various initiatives, providing scholarships, training programs, and resources to those in need. These efforts not only provided education but also built self-esteem and fostered community leadership. One day, as Tunde stood in front of a crowd of young graduates at a national conference, he realized that his vision was no longer just a dream, it had become a reality. The students standing before him, some of whom had once been on the verge of giving up, were now entering the workforce, equipped with the tools and confidence to succeed. Tunde knew that his work would continue, but he also knew that the seeds he had planted would grow far beyond his lifetime. His legacy was not in the programs themselves, but in the lives that had been changed, the young people who were now leading with integrity, compassion, and the same determination he had once struggled to find. As the years passed, Tunde saw his efforts bear fruit. The youth leadership programs had expanded to other African countries, impacting thousands of young people who had once been on the brink of despair. Tunde had become a recognized figure in the fight for youth empowerment, receiving numerous awards and honors. But despite the accolades, Tunde remained focused on what truly mattered, the impact on individual lives. He often visited the communities he had helped, meeting with former students who had become successful entrepreneurs, educators, and leaders in their own right. One day, as he sat in a small village, listening to a former mentee speak about their journey, Tunde felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was why he had started this journey, to change lives and empower others to do the same. Even with all the success, Tunde continued to face challenges. There were times when the programs faced financial struggles, when governments or corporations pulled out of partnerships. But Tunde never lost faith in the cause. He continued to fight for the youth he had dedicated his life to. He also faced criticism, both from those who felt his methods were too idealistic and from those who believed his success had made him out of touch with the real issues facing young people. But Tunde, more than ever, knew that he could not be swayed by the negativity. He had learned that true success wasn't about avoiding challenges, it was about overcoming them, one step at a time. The people who made it possible. As Tunde reflected on everything he had achieved, he knew he owed much of his success to the people who had helped him along the way. His parents, his mentors, and the students who had believed in him had all played a crucial role in shaping the man he had become. He decided to honor them in a special way, organizing a large event to celebrate the individuals and organizations that had supported his work. The event was filled with speeches, performances, and tributes to those who had helped him build the foundation of his programs. It was a celebration not just of his achievements, but of the collective effort that had made it all possible. Tunde realized that his journey had never been a solo one, it had always been about community, support, and collaboration. At the peak of his success, Tunde began to think about the next chapter in his life. He knew that his work with youth empowerment was far from over, but he also felt that it was time to pass the baton to a new generation of leaders. He started working on his next project, an initiative to train young leaders who would continue the work he had started. This program would focus not only on the practical skills needed to lead but also on the emotional and mental resilience required to overcome life's challenges. As Tunde looked toward the future, he felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had been worth every moment. He had found his purpose and had dedicated his life to helping others find theirs. Tunde's new initiative quickly gained traction. He began to travel across the country, meeting with young people who were eager to learn and grow. Many of them had come from difficult backgrounds, just like he had, and they saw Tunde as an example of what was possible when one refused to give up. Through this program, Tunde helped to create a new generation of leaders, young people who were committed to making a difference in their communities. These leaders, in turn, began mentoring others, creating a ripple effect that Tunde had always dreamed of. As he watched this new generation take the reins, Tunde knew that his legacy was secure. The work would continue long after he was gone. Tunde's vision for youth empowerment eventually extended beyond Africa. The programs he had started in Nigeria were replicated in other parts of the world, including Asia and Latin America. Tunde traveled to these countries, sharing his story and inspiring others to take action. The global expansion of his programs brought him into contact with young people from different cultures and backgrounds, each facing their own unique challenges. But the underlying message was the same: change was possible, no matter where you came from or what obstacles you faced. Tunde realized that the work he had started in Nigeria had become a global movement, and he was proud to be a part of something so transformative. It was the culmination of years of hard work and dedication, and Tunde knew that this was only the beginning. Just when everything seemed to be going smoothly, a major crisis threatened to undo much of what Tunde had built. A natural disaster, a devastating flood, struck several regions in Nigeria, affecting communities where Tunde's programs had been established. Homes were destroyed, schools were swept away, and many young people were left without shelter, education, or resources. Tunde's phone rang constantly, with calls pouring in from his team, government officials, and other organizations. They needed his leadership, his vision. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on him. But with his experience in managing large-scale initiatives, Tunde knew what needed to be done. He immediately coordinated with emergency relief teams, ensuring that food, water, and medical supplies reached those in need. But more than that, Tunde saw this as an opportunity to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally. The young people in these communities had suffered greatly, and it was crucial that they had a support system in place to help them recover. Tunde quickly activated his network of mentors and volunteers, launching a national recovery campaign aimed at rebuilding homes, schools, and providing psychological counseling for the affected youth. He worked tirelessly day and night, not allowing the crisis to derail the progress he had worked so hard to build. The disaster became a turning point in Tunde's life, testing his leadership, resilience, and dedication. The flood had caused unimaginable damage, but it also provided an opportunity for Tunde and his team to showcase the power of community. Within weeks, they had mobilized thousands of volunteers, young people, and local leaders to help rebuild the affected areas. They created temporary shelters for those displaced, while also beginning the long-term process of reconstruction. For Tunde, seeing the youth of these communities take charge of the recovery process was both humbling and inspiring. Many of them had once felt powerless, but now they were leading efforts to restore their neighborhoods. Tunde's programs had instilled in them the belief that they could rise above any challenge. The success of the recovery campaign was a testament to the power of resilience and hope. Tunde realized that, even in the darkest moments, the strength of community could transform tragedy into triumph. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the programs he had built were helping to create leaders who were capable of turning adversity into opportunity. As the recovery efforts from the flood continued, Tunde was invited to speak at an international conference on disaster relief and community empowerment. He spoke passionately about the importance of youth leadership, resilience, and the role that young people could play in rebuilding after a crisis. The speech was met with overwhelming praise, and soon, Tunde found himself being sought after by other countries facing similar challenges. The knowledge and experience he had gained from the flood recovery efforts made him a valuable asset to global disaster relief initiatives. But for Tunde, the mission was never just about disaster relief. It was about empowering young people to take control of their futures, no matter the circumstances. The flood had only deepened his commitment to this cause. He decided to launch a new initiative focused on training young leaders specifically for disaster preparedness and community resilience. Tunde's work was evolving, but his core message remained the same: empowering youth was the key to building stronger, more resilient communities. Years passed, and Tunde's programs continued to thrive. But as his influence grew, so did the weight of past mistakes and relationships that had been left unresolved. One day, Tunde received an unexpected message. It was from the girl he had blackmailed back in his boarding school days, Ngozi. She had heard about Tunde's success and reached out to him, expressing her desire to meet and talk. For years, Tunde had carried the guilt of how he had treated her. His actions in the past haunted him, and he knew that he needed to make amends. They arranged to meet at a quiet cafe, and when Tunde saw Ngozi for the first time in years, he was overwhelmed with emotion. She had grown into a strong, confident woman, but there was still a subtle sadness in her eyes, one that Tunde knew he had caused. "I'm so sorry," Tunde said, his voice thick with regret. "I betrayed your trust, and I hate you. I can't undo the past, but I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Ngozi looked at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. After a long pause, she spoke. "I have forgiven you, Tunde," she said softly. "Not for you, but for me. Holding on to the anger was only hurting me. I've moved on." Tunde felt a weight lift off his shoulders. In that moment, he realized that forgiveness wasn't just about reconciliation, it was about healing. It was a moment of closure, and it marked the final step in Tunde's own journey of redemption. With his personal life now in a place of peace and reconciliation, Tunde returned his focus to his work. His international reputation continued to grow, and his network of youth leaders spread across continents. The programs he had founded were now being implemented in countries all over the world, from Africa to Southeast Asia to Latin America. But Tunde never lost sight of the core principles that had shaped his success: compassion, resilience, and the belief that every young person, no matter their background, had the potential to lead. He began organizing annual global summits, bringing together youth leaders from different countries to share ideas, strategies, and success stories. These gatherings became a platform for young people to collaborate on tackling the world's most pressing challenges, from climate change to poverty to inequality. Tunde was proud to see how his work had not only transformed individual lives but had sparked a global movement, a movement led by the very people he had mentored. It was the ultimate manifestation of his vision, a world where young people were in the driver's seat, leading the charge for positive change. With his personal life now in a place of peace and reconciliation, Tunde returned his focus to his work. His international reputation continued to grow, and his network of youth leaders spread across continents. The programs he had founded were now being implemented in countries all over the world, from Africa to Southeast Asia to Latin America. But Tunde never lost sight of the core principles that had shaped his success: compassion, resilience, and the belief that every young person, no matter their background, had the potential to lead. He began organizing annual global summits, bringing together youth leaders from different countries to share ideas, strategies, and success stories. These gatherings became a platform for young people to collaborate on tackling the world's most pressing challenges, from climate change to poverty to inequality. Tunde was proud to see how his work had not only transformed individual lives but had sparked a global movement, a movement led by the very people he had mentored. It was the ultimate manifestation of his vision, a world where young people were in the driver's seat, leading the charge for positive change. Tunde began the process of grooming the next generation of leaders to take on more responsibility. He identified several promising individuals within his network, people who had worked closely with him for years and had demonstrated the qualities of great leadership. Tunde worked alongside them, sharing his knowledge and wisdom, preparing them for the day when he would step back fully. He was no longer driven by the need to control everything. He had learned the importance of delegation and trust. As he passed the torch, Tunde felt a sense of peace. He knew that the work he had started would continue to grow, driven by a new generation of leaders who would take it further than he ever could. His legacy was no longer about his personal accomplishments, but about the community of leaders he had built. As Tunde stepped into this new chapter of his life, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His programs were thriving, his relationships were healed, and his role in the world was clear. He had gone from a lost and confused boy to a man who had shaped the future for so many others. Tunde's journey was a testament to the power of redemption, the importance of self-reflection, and the enduring impact of compassionate leadership. He had learned that true success was not defined by accolades or wealth, but by the lives you touched and the changes you inspired. With a heart full of gratitude, Tunde looked ahead to the future. He knew there would be new challenges, new opportunities, and new paths to explore. But whatever came next, he was ready. The road had been long, but it had led him to exactly where he was meant to be. And for Tunde, that was enough. You enjoyed the story? If so, please like the video, comment what you learned from the tale, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more enchanting tales just like this one. Thank you.